So, Andy, maybe you can start off by giving your name and the date and where we are,
Okay.
and that will.
My name's Andy Major, and we're at the Women's Information Center in Syracuse, and it's the 1st of June, 2008.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your activist life?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I grew up on Long Island in an upper middle class family where my parents very much modeled and taught us that we had a responsibility to the larger community. They were involved in more social service, recreational kinds of activities, not in kind of overt social change. And when I was a senior in high school, the accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant happened. And that was very frightening to me and lots of people, and I sort of began to explore it and went to a meeting at Friends World College, which is a sort of alternative Quaker place on Long Island, and heard analysis about the nuclear power industry and its connection to the government that it just made sense to me and fit with my sort of perceptions of the world. And so I got involved in the movement against nuclear power. There was a nuclear plant being constructed on Long Island in Shoreham that I became active in opposing, and then became involved in the anti-nuclear movement when I went to college that next fall. And then in January of that year, in his State of the Union address, President Carter called for the reinstitution of draft registration. And since I was one of the people directly affected, that sort of caused me to begin to think more directly about war and peace. And I quickly realized that I was a conscientious objector and wouldn't participate in war. And that was sort of the beginning of my involvement in the peace movement. And then that became sort of the center of my life. I quit college to focus on work in the peace movement. And I came here to Syracuse because my partner at the time, Karen Beadle, got a job here at the Syracuse Peace Council. And it was through her was my direct connection in terms of the peace encampment, because she was one of the kind of core organizers from the beginning of the project.
Uh-huh. Can you talk a little bit about what happened with your draft resistance?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, when the law went into effect and the registration process began, I knew that I wouldn't register, and it was sort of a series of steps over several years for me to decide to really speak publicly and openly about my refusal to register. And I began doing that, to anyone who'd listen. And eventually that led to my being prosecuted for refusing to register for the draft, and I spent about 4.5 months in federal prison for that. And there was actually, the same people who prosecuted me for refusing to register also prosecuted me and many others for acts of civil disobedience at Griffiths Air Force Base, which is to the east of Syracuse. And we had this wonderful geographic situation of, 40 miles to the east were nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and 50 miles to the west were the major transshipment and storage area for the Pershing and other weapons to Europe. So I was involved in organizing at both places, and in some of the trials for actions at Griffiths, I talked about my actions there being part of what I thought was a consistent pattern of opposition to war and trying to live conscientiously. And that one of the other things that I did was refuse to register for the draft, and so that was a piece then used in the prosecution against me. But there were plenty of public statements that I had made, and I was not hiding my choice not to register.
Right.
So I was indicted in the fall of 1984, and then tried and imprisoned in 85.
Right. Okay, so I remember being aware of that because it was happening while I was at the peace camp, and so let's go back then to how you got involved with Karen. I mean, you were involved with Karen, and Karen was part of organizing the peace camp. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was a very exciting time, and there was a sense that that we were in great danger with the deployment of these missiles to Europe and the movement to a much more hair-trigger alert system on the part of the Soviet Union. And there was this growing grassroots movement of opposition to these weapons. And there was a lot of sort of connection between what was happening in Europe and what was happening here, and what was happening here in upstate New York and in Ontario, and to some degree Quebec, but primarily Ontario. And what had happened at Greenham Common was very inspirational, and I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if Greenham Common was inspired to some degree by the Women's Pentagon Action, which was something that Karen had participated in back when we lived in Rhode Island before we came to upstate New York, and was a very moving, powerful action. And the statement, the unity statement of the Women's Pentagon Action is still, I think, one of the most powerful statements of the crisis we face and how we need to move forward to transform our society. So as a man with kind of a budding feminist consciousness, I was challenged by a lot of this thinking and very much wanted to act in solidarity with women and support women's empowerment and women taking action to try and avert the catastrophes that we were facing. And I was, one of the things that drew Karen and I to the Peace Council was that they had a really holistic analysis, that clearly the organization had been greatly influenced by the early feminist movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and adopted a collective process and consensus decision making, and really tried to learn the lessons of how to work together in egalitarian ways. That the feminist movement, I think, was so key in spreading that thinking. So I was a little surprised as it began to be discussed in the Peace Council that there was some resistance on the part of some people, primarily men, to the Peace Council supporting wholeheartedly an action that was a women's only action. And I wanted to try and do what I could to both organize men to support the encampment and to try and help men who were feeling defensive or resistant understand things in a more full, subtle kind of way.
Do you remember some of the things that they were resistant about, or what the sort of dialogue
Well, I think
was?
a lot of it is that, the very typical kinds of problems that white people have with black-only actions or men with women-only actions, a sense of somehow that it was discriminatory towards men, that men were being excluded from, and clearly there was this momentum building, there was real excitement about this action and what was happening. And I think a real lack of understanding of the dynamics of oppression and the critical differences between white men acting and organizing alone as power holders in ways that discriminated against people who were less powerful, and traditionally marginalized or targeted groups organizing collectively on their own as a way to sort of build strength, gain skills, demonstrate the importance and the power of the kind of the societal oppression that existed. So I think those were the main things. I mean, there were also more, in my mind, reasonable issues of organizational priorities and limited resources and those kinds of things. And what ended up happening in like many similar organizations, Karen was a staff person at the Peace Council at that time, and like her coworkers primarily worked 60 hours a week, for $60 a week or something like that. And so she worked more than she was supposed to work on the primary Peace Council work anyway, so people couldn't really complain so much. But she ended up sort of taking a leave of absence for a chunk of the summer to work, solely on the encampment. And one of her largest responsibility at the Peace Council was coordinating the publication of the newsletter. And so I filled in for her doing that through those several months so that she could be out at the encampment primarily and not have to worry about what was happening here.
In your understanding of feminism and oppression work, was there a point for you that you had to wrestle with some of those issues, or was it sort of organic, your understanding coming from other protest cultures?
Well, it certainly was I mean, I was raised in a family where there were different rules for the boys and girls. My father has grown a lot over the years. My youngest sister is a lesbian, and so they've had to grapple with that and are really very loving and accepting of her and her partner. So I had some work to do, although I remember in high school around dating, wondering why so many of the girls were attracted to men or boys who were mean and chauvinist, and so I don't feel like I was never on an extreme end with that, but I also didn't have much. I needed my consciousness raised to understand, because I hadn't experienced what it was like to be black or to be a woman. I saw these different rules for my sisters and felt like, well, that's not quite right, but I don't remember overtly challenging them or standing in solidarity with my sisters. But one of the strongest lessons for me was I was very interested in solar power when I was going into college, and was encouraged to go into an engineering track initially, which wasn't really what made sense for me. But I was in an introductory engineering class, probably the first day, and African American man, or maybe it was more than one, came in and talked very briefly about the African American Engineering Club or Society or something like that. And I turned to a white guy next to me, and said, "That's weird. Why do they need that?" Perhaps I was even stronger in my negative reaction to it than an African American man within a couple of rows of me heard it and turned to me and said, "You have no idea what it's like. We need this, and you need to learn something." And that really hit me. And then in the through the work, I was at Brown University, through the activist work that I was involved with there were lots of pieces that just sort of raised my consciousness as part of nonviolence training and looking at oppression issues within that. And I became part of a gay lesbian sort of education effort there as well. So it's been a process, and I'm a firm believer that racism and sexism and homophobia are so embedded in the culture that they're in all of us, and that it's an ongoing struggle to rid ourselves of those things, but that those of us in the dominant group, in whatever the sort of dynamic is, have a responsibility to try and support and stand in solidarity with those who are being targeted. And that was and my perspective on it is really quite identical now to what it was 25 years ago, working around the encampment.
And did you feel like at the Peace Council itself that your efforts to try to share where you were coming from and as a group to grapple with the idea of the encampment, was that resolved? What were some of the strategies you used?
Mm-hmm. Well, it never sort of turned into a huge rift within the organization. And I think, probably the sort of the resolution in terms of Karen's time, and she, I'm trying to think who was on staff at the time besides her. She and Leah Mahoney, and must have been another person. Gary Weinstein, I guess. So I think it was her and two men. And one of them had more problems with it than the other, I think. But the idea of her getting a leave of absence and us figuring out a way organizationally to be sure that the critical work she was doing for the organization was carried on was a reasonable solution. And it would have been nicer if she could have been paid for some of the time she was putting in the encampment, and the Peace Council embracing it more fully as a Peace Council project. One of the one of the specific things that I worked on was this educational program, a forum for men on the women's peace camp that was, the flyer says, "Come share feelings and thoughts about the encampment with other men. Learn about activities women have scheduled for this summer and find out what men are doing to support their efforts and how you can help." So there was a sense that talking process, figuring things out, being in a place with men, and I think I'm not sure, but my sense is that we probably tried to limit this to as an event for men, so that men would feel comfortable voicing some of their garbage without feeling like they had to censor it because there were women there who would hear their sexist thoughts or feelings or ideas. To process, though, the struggles for them and the fears of what it might mean. But then hopefully to move from that to then how can we show solidarity? And there was a small group of us here, and there was a man, Ray Stiefel, out in Wayne County at the time, who was also a key person, the efforts were somewhat successful. We talked about, and we obviously sought suggestions about what would be useful for us to do. And the guidance we were given was this kind of educational work, providing food for some major events, and perhaps helping with childcare. And there had been discussion and some effort at sort of setting up a sort of little men's place where we could be maybe staffed on weekends to provide childcare, and it never really sort of fully came together, in part because there wasn't enough support. And there was probably, I'm sure there was diversity of perspective among women at the encampment and organizers about how much they wanted any help from men. So, and I very much sort of came at it as, if you don't want help, that's fine, and we don't want to do things that will add to the controversy and problems at the encampment. Particularly once after the I don't know if the main opening was July 4th, but July 4th was a real critical piece with the whole offer of the flag and no, we don't want the flag, and so that sort of was a big start to recognizing the intensity of the confrontations that would go on that summer and beyond.
Was there a communication between, like, Finger Lakes Alliance and other peace groups, men from Finger Lakes Alliance get together with the Syracuse?
Sort of regional.
Right. There was this one man, Ray Stiefel, and I'm not sure that he was even that involved in sort of other peace organizing in Wayne County. But I don't remember really, Bob Staley Mays, I think, was in Rochester then, or he might have been in Syracuse. But he certainly was supportive. But there wasn't, I don't really remember connecting with men in Ithaca, for example. So there wasn't really that regional, concrete regional framework that kind of evolved the way there was with the encampment organizing.
This flyer you were showing us, was that something, gathering that would have been happening at the encampment, or
no, that was here in
before?
Syracuse.
Okay, before you went.
Yep.
And prior to the encampment, was there some sort of a men's group or a place that men went to discuss oppression and such?
Yeah, there was a group at that time called the Syracuse Men's Group that I was part of, that was sort of men's consciousness raising, trying to understand how we could be men and human beings, and wanting to support boys being raised in gentle, loving ways, and girls as well, with full options to, be whoever they wanted to be. And certainly some men in the men's group were part of this effort. I don't have a recollection that group sort of, as a whole, sort of took this on as a project. So there may have been some controversy within that group about it. But that recollection is not so clear for me. But that was an important piece for my growth and development. And I had been, when I was in college in Rhode Island, and then Karen and I went cross-country and lived in Portland, Oregon for a short period of time. In both of those places, I was sort of looking for some kind of men's consciousness-raising group, and when I got here, there was something, and that was really helpful for me.
Wow. So do you, you did support, do you remember the August 1st?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and somewhere, and I thought about whether I've had it, but somewhere there's a photo of me with a little, not very interesting looking display, and we had hummus sandwiches or some other food along part of the major march route that day. And I don't know if Ruth Putter might have, it might be one of her photos, or so yeah, I remember being there that day and it being a sort of hot, long day, but feeling, and also, and I had this, several times I dropped Karen at the encampment or was around the encampment, and I always had a sort of, am I welcome here? Is this okay? Feeling, and I remember having a little bit of that day, but less so than any time being more at the encampment.
Were you ever aware of any of the negativity that was kind of projected at the camp from townspeople or passing vehicles and?
Sure. It began around that summer, but I was a paid organizer for it was in October, but there was as part of nationally coordinated actions, there was a major civil disobedience action at Seneca Army Depot in the October of 1983, and so I coordinated the statewide effort at organizing for the civil disobedience part of it. There was a legal rally and then civil disobedience, and so certainly connected with that, and just hearing from Karen and others, it was very clear that there was great hostility, and there were some quite legitimate fears of violence.
Did I interrupt you, Sue?
No, I was going to ask to talk about a little bit more about that action, because did you, that was at like Sampson, and
there was a rally at Sampson, and the rally was probably on the Saturday, and then on Monday was the civil disobedience, where we attempted to block all 6 gates maybe to the depot, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people who participated and many hundreds arrested. It was the largest civil disobedience action ever at the depot. And on that day, the encampment served as a communications hub, and I had a really different feel then than when I'd been around when it was encampment actions. I felt much more that the encampment was sort of part of this larger effort, and that it was fine to be in there and checking the phones and that sort of thing. So it was a very powerful day, and there was an elderly woman who was part of, although I sort of had a lot of coordinating responsibilities that day, so couldn't just sort of be in my affinity group participating in the action, but there was a elderly woman from Syracuse, Lillian Reiner, who was a longtime activist here, who was part of my affinity group, and I remember her having, her sitting on her kind of lawn chair and being confronted by some local yahoo who was, very angry, and some being glad that nobody got hurt in the process. So, and I don't remember if there were specifics about it, but I remember a sense of fear of like the farmhouse being burned down at the encampment, and so there was a real fear, and just the the hatred in the language, so.
Yeah, many, there were a number of women that we've interviewed have talked about that specific action as their memorable connection. Benjamin Spock being there, and
Right.
a number of them apparently were in the cell with him or his wife, and so that I was anxious to hear about the connection, how the coordination, because eventually the peace camp was a place for many different groups who came to do actions at the depot, would meet and park and gather themselves and form their affinity groups, and so there were lots of mixed actions that went out from the encampment in later years.
Yeah, and I think that, maybe that action sort of marked a transition point, because the summer, the organizing before it, and then that summer was the sort of real focus of the women's action there, and then the organizing for the October action certainly was happening in the summer, although the encampment folks mostly were focused on all the intense actions happening at that point. But I have a recollection, I don't know if it's accurate, of Leanne being one of the people who represented the encampment in the broader organizing, because there were certainly a number of regional meetings to do planning that involved folks from the various upstate cities, from New York City, Boston, and the encampment was an important player in that. So, it's interesting because I think my strongest memory, and it's not direct, was the march that was blockaded in Waterloo. In some ways, that's the...
I want you to start with that, because I just want to flip this tape so you don't miss it. And I think it's there we go. Okay. The March in Waterloo. Tell us what you remember about that.
Well, I wasn't there, but that sort of epitomized the summer to me in some ways. These powerful women marching to the, and I guess it was, I don't know, I think it was from the Women's Historical Museum to the encampment, Barbara Deming being among them, who's, certainly a great heroine of mine. And local people being so afraid, so needing to support their country and its insanity to block them, and law enforcement allowing them to block them and then arresting the women for sitting down and trying to diffuse a violent situation. So to me, that really captured the essence of the summer and the things that had happened there. So, and I wasn't there. I don't think, none of my, Karen or Carolyn Mao or Carrie Stearns, who were the women who were I was closest to, I don't know that any of them were there. So it was all from photos and other reports about it that I got it.
I'm curious about something you said about sort of visiting the camp and having a feeling of, is it okay, is it not okay? And I wonder, was there any interactions you had with women that helped you feel that way? Or
I don't remember anything really overt. And maybe it was part of my kind of ultra sensitivity of not wanting to step on anyone's toes. And I knew that there were varying degrees of perspective within the encampment. That there were sort of women who lived their lives in separation from men to as great a degree as they could, and women who were in romantic relationships with men, and that I had been involved in enough organizing to know that there's always tensions in groups, and felt that there were enough much larger issues that that the women needed to have time and energy to attend to than my going further onto the land than was comfortable for every woman. So.
And when you were sort of theorizing or getting ready for this idea of a women's only action in the encampment, and I'm hearing that you understood the political necessity for that, and you were okay with that. Was there anything, once it actually took place and you were part of it, that was jarring to you or different than your expectation, or more or less or different what you would imagine?
Well, there was some of the, and I think some of this is some of the Greenham influence, some of the sort of real outrageousness was is just not my style. So, but I'd experienced that. Karen and I were at a gay pride march in San Francisco a couple of years before that, and that had more outrageousness than the encampment stuff. So, and I guess as someone who identified at that time and continued to identify as a pacifist, some of the kind of real intense anger and sort of how that fits in with more traditional notions of nonviolence, and that same sort of tension carried through later on, several years later, when I was involved in some of the actions around AIDS. There was that same kind of, this is not an A.J. Musty style, people being proper and quiet and asserting our rights, but people screaming and So.
When you're speaking of that, where was that happening? How was that happening?
At the fence.
You saw it at the gate, at the Pennsylvania gate. And was it a dramatization of rage, or you actually just saw?
I guess I guess there were times. And I wasn't around it a lot, but because I wasn't there very much for the encampment actions. Mostly, I saw it as real, heartfelt anger and outrage at what was happening, the terrible crimes being committed both on a global scale and the violence against women in our homes and communities. And I understood that level of outrage. I think then certainly I felt like politically and tactically it didn't make good sense. I think I was more comfortable with it by the time of ACT UP's work.
And were you aware of some women at that time who were doing spray painting the signs or the gate, or bolt cutting the gate, or painting was that something that you deemed nonviolence? Or was that even
no, I don't have any problem with controlled property destruction. I don't.
A.J. Musty's okay?
I don't know about A.J. Musty. He just came to mind. He was not a particular hero of mine. One of the first civil disobedience actions I was involved in, we poured blood on a statue. So no, that wasn't an issue at all.
And you and Karen were romantically involved in that time?
Yeah.
And I'm curious about sort of the political theory and that you're doing this thing, and were there points where it was personally challenging in terms of your personal relationship, as in the person was political? Mm-hmm. How did that play out?
Certainly, and we, in many ways, we were better comrades than partners for many years. We worked together very well. Karen's and she doesn't do organizing anymore, but she was just a brilliant organizer. So yeah, there was lots of separation. I don't know how personal to get on it.
To you.
So yeah, there were being in an atmosphere that was very women-centered, women-focused, lots of women-loving women. She, as part of one of the pieces of us splitting up was her choosing to be a lesbian. And that wasn't something that I had hard feelings about. There were lots of other issues that made sense for us not to be together in that way. So that wasn't a real significant piece of it, which was nice. That would have complicated things if there was great tension between sort of the philosophical, political piece and more personal parts coming into conflict, but it really wasn't. significant way.
And were there parts where just something that intense is happening and she was there more than you could be there? How did you guys try to reconcile that, or did you? Was it just sort of, you know, she's going to go do that and you're going to do your thing, or did you try to find common ground in it and share it?
Well, certainly, you know, some of my desire to support the encampment was probably related to that. You know, and I can't remember, I think I had actually quit my typesetting job, so it was it worked well to do her piece at the Peace Council that summer. But sort of, I mean, I felt very much a part of it in a good way of what was happening. And certainly there were times when, you know, there weren't cell phones then, so we weren't very closely in touch. But I felt like she was off, you know, serving the nonviolent revolution, and that was great. So in the, as long as I mentioned the typesetting piece, I did the typesetting for the handbook.
Handbook.
I remember that now, okay.
Yeah, well, because that was before desktop publishing, so typesetting was a very expensive thing to have to pay for. So I was able to just work. I'm trying to think. I'm pretty sure I was working with the Syracuse New Times, where I didn't work late at night typically, but somehow I was able to do the typesetting for it.
And were you a part of the content at all?
Not overtly, no. And there was and take a look at it to see. I remember one of the pieces, and this probably is a piece that reflects a little on my sense of hesitation about being around the encampment, maybe, is that there were two pieces written by men in here that I'm aware of. And they're not, let's see, or well, maybe the labor one was too. Are no things?
They're not credited. Are they not credited?
Let's see.
Yeah.
The labor one is not, and the conversion one is not. There's a mix of stuff that's credited and not credited. But my recollection was that there had been a bunch of conversation about that, and a decision was made not to. Well, but then here's something that's adapted from a talk by Michael Clare. But I remember very clearly that there's a piece about rural organizing that was written by Dave Stern in Wayne County that I'm pretty sure wasn't credited, and then a piece about economic conversion that was written by Tom Joyce that wasn't credited, and that there was a feeling of not wanting to have men sort of, not to not credit them, but to sort of not sully the women-only piece of it or something.
with a male name.
Right.
And are
although
women
let's see,
not credited?
there is a people who made this handbook possible, that does list that I'm on there, and Bob Staley Mays and some other folks, some other men. So.
But the articles by the women are credited?
It's actually a mix. It looks like.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of stuff. Oh, actually, I'm wrong about the rural organizing piece. That was written by two women out in Wayne County.
Or we think.
We've heard the handbook is still very pertinent to many, many groups. Still use that as an organizing handbook. It's well put together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. And Karen and I worked a lot on various publishing stuff over years. So certainly we had conversations as it was being sort of thought about and crafted, but I don't remember having, I think that the typesetting is the piece that I remember doing, and I don't recall having a significant role in other pieces, really. I mean, probably some discussions about who would be a good person to write this piece or that piece.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could, just for the record kind of thing, if you could give us a little description of Griffiths and the activism that was happening just historically, so folks can understand what that was.
Sure. Well, Griffiths was a strategic air command base, and I hope a lot of people have highlighted the fact that both Griffiths and Seneca, although what we called for all along was sort of planned efforts to convert them to economically viable, socially useful uses, that didn't happen that way in either case, but they both were shut down and don't serve those functions anymore. So Griffiths wasn't as rural an area as Seneca Army Depot was. It's right in the city of Rome, which is a small city, and it's close to Utica, which is a bigger city that's much bigger than anything close to the Seneca Army Depot. So it didn't have that quite the same sort of rural feel, and there were a few more local allies than there were around Seneca. But overall, it was a community that was very hostile to peace activism because their economy was based around the Air Force Base. So there's a history of actions. We have photos from a Peace Council action there in the early 1960s, and I don't know when it was when the base opened up. But there were some actions in the late 70s, and then they sort of continued at a fairly steady pace. Sort of culminating around the 82-83 time when there was such concern about the Euro missile deployment. And I'm trying to think of, I'm not certain about the years. There was a walk, this must have been 82 because Carrie Stearns was very involved in it, and that wouldn't have made sense with the peace camp. There was a walk from, I think, Kingston, Ontario, down to Griffiths, and that culminated in civil disobedience there. And I'm trying to think of the timing, because the years are a little fuzzy. And then there was a larger, maybe it was in the summer of 83, or maybe it was the summer of 84, there was a larger action at Griffiths where a little over 100 people were arrested. And I was one of the key organizers of that. And out of that, the judge sentenced a handful of us to jail time. Carolyn Mao was one of them, myself and a few other people who were seen as, repeat offenders or key organizers. The prosecution really kind of, they asked, who did the nonviolence training for you and that sort of thing to try and go after the organizers more. So in there, I recall, at least for one of those actions, there being an affinity group from the encampment that came and participated as well. So there was I always felt that the encampment was and saw itself as part of this of a larger, peace and social justice movement, a larger anti-nuclear movement, but had a particular focus, just as most any group will have a particular focus.
In your estimation of the anti-nuclear activism happening in this area, was there any difference between mixed actions and a Seneca or a women's action? Did you notice anything maybe after Seneca that the women were still involved in mixed actions? There was an influence of anything that they brought from Seneca, or was it pretty much consistent?
Very good question. I think there was maybe a little more sense of let's experiment, let's try and push the borders of what's traditionally been done or been seen as acceptable. But I don't easily come up with concrete examples. And I mean, one of the things that came out of the, there was the encampment, there was the big action in that fall at Seneca, and there'd been all this regional organizing with both pieces, and there was a sense, we hadn't won the struggle, as of mid-October, late October, I can't remember the exact dates. And so there was kind of a network of affinity groups that continued meeting and ended up planning this like week or 10 days of actions in December of '83, where there were actions at Seneca and actions at Griffiths. And several years later, after I got out of jail, when I got my FBI file, it was interesting to see how concerned they were about those actions, because they were small, they were more autonomous, they weren't sort of so publicly organized. There was a real, so that was interesting to me, and I think the encampment certainly had an influence on that that style. Kind of encourage small groups of people to form, to develop a sense of solidarity and figure out what they could do, how they could take action to make a difference.
I'm curious how you got to see your FBI file.
I filed the Freedom of Information Act.
And at that point, were able to get it.
Yeah, and I probably got it in '86 or '87, so it's a long time ago now, and I've always been curious to see what else there would be. And one other brief note that the two things that were surprising, most of it was completely publicly available documents. But the piece about the 10 days of actions was a surprise to me. And the other piece was that there had been, one of the Canadian groups we worked with was called the Cruise Missile Conversion Project, that was based in Toronto and worked at a Lytton Systems plant that built the guidance systems for the cruise missiles. And there was a group called Direct Action that set a bomb at that plant that blew up, and a guard was killed. And through my FBI file, I found out that I was connected with that. Which highlighted I'd had similar feelings when the bombing happened, and the group blamed the security guards, and their poor response to the warnings they were given was the reason that someone was killed. And I felt that was a bunch of crap, that, when you play with weapons and people get hurt, you need to take responsibility for your role in that. And then realizing that I'd been connected with it, sort of only reinforced that feeling. And at the same time, that action really, really disrupted the ongoing nonviolent organizing of the Cruise Missile Conversion Project. The RC, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, shut down their office, took all their files. There was, they had been working to build relationships with workers at the plant. All of that was sort of, back to zero after the bombing happened. So.
Yeah.
What's your sense of feminism today, and is there still a need for women-only actions at this time in life?
Well, there were some women-only organizing in like 2002, 2003, something like that, connected with the Iraq War here in Syracuse. It's frustrating to me that there's this sort of sense of a post-feminism in the culture at large, and a sense that we don't need a feminist movement, a sense among young women, lack of understanding of it, and both the opportunities they have because of the struggles that women before them have waged, and how far they are from really, having full equality. And even more than that, really, is the sense that we're not talking about liberation anymore. We're talking about equality in a fucked up system, and that's the piece that I think is most sad, that we're no longer talking about a feminism that seeks to transform society, or that's certainly the mainstream understanding of it, and a more radical, transformative feminist movement doesn't really exist, now, or those organizations are not there. So at the same time, and I think this is very connected to the women's movement in my mind, is that the most dramatic change I've seen in my life is around gay lesbian issues, and particularly young people. You know, that there are, I have a niece who's thinks I'm from Mars. It's my partner's family, and they live here in Syracuse, and she's been staying with us some because she's having troubles getting along with her mom, and she's 15. And I was sort of shocked that, you know, two of her girlfriends are in a relationship. And it's, you know, that's just fine. It's no big deal. So that piece, you know, at the same time, you know, there still is horrific gay bashing and this right-wing sense that somehow it's evil. But, you know, in a lot of ways on the ground, much of that struggle or the culture has really shifted in a major way. And that's really, you know, heartening to see.
You were shocked? What do you mean you were shocked?
Well, I was shocked that my niece, who's so straight, was so comfortable with it. And my vegetarianism and our composting and stuff is like from Mars to her. But
she had that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about, is your sense on her, but in terms of racism, does that apply as well in terms of a 15-year-old's understanding of oppression, that the queer is okay, or is it not?
Well, not as much. I think there's been a bigger shift. In part maybe because I think that there's been more sort of effort, you know, sort of we're past racism, you know, that's really been drummed into people. So I think she has, you know, I'm not sure what her take would be on, you know, dating an African-American young man or anything like that. But I guess I'm not as optimistic about it, that piece. So.
What about your take on where we are in terms of nuclear weapons and plants and power in the country right now compared to 30 years ago? How are we doing on that end?
Well, there's no significant grassroots movement, you know, opposing either. And there's this major effort to restart nuclear power plants, which I guess it wasn't as clear in the kind of early 80s as it became by the late 80s and beyond. There was a sense that nuclear power was dead, you know, as an industry, that it was just too, and unfortunately it wasn't the danger as much as the economics of it that were killing it. And I think the dangers of nuclear weapons are not perhaps quite as bad as it was then, in the sense of kind of this nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union feeling like a real possibility. But there's, you know, the U.S. has most of the nuclear arsenal it had back then. The Soviet Union's, what's left of its nuclear arsenal is much less protected than it was, and this sense of smaller nuclear weapons being available to folks who would use them is, you know, very frightening.
Do you have any idea of the number of nuclear weapons that the U.S. has?
I don't know.
I just saw a figure and I'm trying to check it out. And it was like some horrible thing, like 107.
More than that we need, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, of course.
Well, and I saw a quote from John McCain talking about wanting to drastically scale back the nuclear arsenal, you know, needing to maintain what we need to protect ourselves. And my understanding is that Barack Obama has, you know, talked about nuclear abolition as a goal. And there's a number of former Defense Department officials and other sort of people who have, you know, been at the controls of these weapons who have also been talking about nuclear abolition. So I think that with the Iraq War continuing to rage, it's hard to pay attention to something like nuclear weapons that feels is more theoretical as a danger right now. But it would be great if that momentum could be built upon and really work. I mean, you know, we can't destroy the knowledge and to produce these weapons, but if we could get our government to make a commitment to get rid of ours and try to work internationally, that would be such an advancement. And it continues to just gall me that we talk about other people can't have weapons of mass destruction while we maintain the greatest nuclear arsenal in the world. It's just outrageous. And
So we have a little bit of time left. I was curious if the sort of discussion you spoke about in preparation and during Seneca among men in the Peace Council, if you can speak to the state of sexism today in the work that you do around peace. Is it stuff that needs to be discussed anymore? Is the consciousness raised to such a place that you're doing good in that arena?
it's interesting to try and say, are we in a different place than we were then? I mean, in some ways, then there was more grappling and struggle with these issues than there is now. I think that I remember being at a War Resisters League national conference in the early 80s in California, and there being a huge controversy about women-only time at the swimming pool. And a bunch of that generation who were the most fighting that are gone, are not hardly active anymore. And I think that younger folks coming in don't have the sort of really hardened, old-style attitudes, but neither are they coming into the movement at a time when there's real fervent discussion of these issues, which was really important for me and really transformative. So I'm not sure. I think sometimes we assume too much with people coming in. And the most concrete example of the progress still needed in my mind, and this is not so much sort of core people around the Peace Council, but more in the larger community, or people who are more peripheral, is that I'm one of 3 paid staff at the Peace Council, and one of the others, Carol Baum, who you probably have interviewed or will interview, she worked at the Peace Council running the bookstore when Karen and I moved to Syracuse, and left staff at some point in the 80s, and she and I came back onto staff together at the beginning of 2002, in part as part of rebuilding the Peace Council after September 11th. And so she and I came on at the same time as equals. She has longer history with the organization. And then the third staff person is a younger woman, Jessica Maxwell, who was hired about a year later. So has also been on staff for 5 years. And lots of people want to call me the director, and there's nothing written or said by the organization to give that indication at all. I tend to write more and certainly speak publicly more than Carol in particular, who's just not as comfortable with public speaking. But that's and that's something we sort of struggle with how to respond to.